For decades, Canada and the United States were inseparable. Military allies, trade partners, best friends on the world stage. They fought side by side in Korea, stormed through Afghanistan, and built one of the closest defense ties of any two nations on Earth. Even when they disagreed on Vietnam, Iraq, and CIA activities, nothing truly broke the bond. Washington and Ottawa always found a way back, until now. The new Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, is no longer looking south, he's turning east, to Europe. But why? Why is Canada leaving its longtime ally behind? And what does Europe have that the US suddenly doesn't? Keep watching to find out. With how monumental this shift is, it only makes sense to meet the man behind it first. So let's do just that. Let's meet Mark Carney. After all, for the past decade, the title of Prime Minister of Canada has been almost synonymous with one name, Justin Trudeau. His youthful charisma and bold progressive vision catapulted the Liberals from political underdogs to a governing powerhouse in 2015. But after nearly 10 years in power, the Trudeau brand had worn thin. Scandals, economic struggles, and political fatigue chipped away at his once unshakable support. Even his own party began to turn on him. And so Trudeau stepped down. And who took his place? A man with no seat in parliament, no experience in electoral politics, but a resume that screams global power player. Mark Carney. A career banker, the man who guided Canada through the 2008 financial crisis as Governor of the Bank of Canada, the same man Britain trusted to lead the Bank of England through Brexit, a familiar face in Europe, a heavyweight in the world of trade, finance, and international negotiations, and now Canada's new Prime Minister. However, Carney wasn't just chosen to steady the ship, he was chosen to chart a new course. A course that looks less and less like Trudeau's Canada and more like Europe's closest ally. But how can we be so sure that Carney is truly changing course for Canada? Well, he isn't exactly being subtle about it. After becoming Prime Minister, Carney didn't waste any time making a bold statement on the global stage. Instead of heading south to meet with his longtime ally, the US, he made a historic move. His first visit took him straight to Europe. Carney's whirlwind European tour started in Paris, where he had lunch with French President Emmanuel Macron. And the two men weren't just passing pleasantries. Macron, who greeted Carney as an old friend, reaffirmed the relationship between Canada and France, stating, "We are receiving a man who loves his country, who is committed to his country." Macron's support for Carney wasn't just diplomatic, it was personal. The two have known each other for years, and Macron clearly trusts Carney's leadership, something Carney no doubt needed to show the world. From Paris, Carney jetted off to London, where the reception was equally significant. He met with British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer and even had a highly symbolic audience with King Charles III. And these were no ceremonial visits. This was a Prime Minister announcing in no uncertain terms that his country was shifting its focus, seeking deeper ties with Europe. Oh, and did we mention that Carney speaks French and English? A skill that made the French and British feel right at home with him. It's a skill that, in an era of political polarization, gives Carney a subtle edge. Here's the real kicker though. No modern Canadian Prime Minister has ever made Europe their first stop after being sworn in. Ever. That's how monumental Carney's trip was. Monumental and calculated. Carney was signaling that he valued the deep-rooted European relationships far more than the traditional North American partnership that's defined Canada's identity for decades. Despite Carney's trip not yielding any specific new commitments, the visit served two major purposes. One, to display to the world that Canada has other allies beyond the US, and two, to bolster Carney's credibility on the world stage as he prepares to face Canadian voters. Let's look at the first purpose more closely. Why is Canada looking for other allies when its long-time relationship with the US has been its cornerstone for so long? The answer lies in the somewhat erratic behavior of US President Donald Trump. Over the course of his presidency, he made a series of comments and took actions that not only tested but actively undermined the long-standing relationship between Canada and the US. Perhaps most shockingly, Trump suggested that Canada should become the 51st US state, explaining his reasoning by the fact that the US subsidizes Canada by $200 billion a year. He went on to claim that Canadians would benefit from this annexation, saying they'd pay half of what they're paying now. At first, everyone, including Canada, thought he was joking, but as the calls for erasing the 5,520-mile-long border between the countries kept repeating, no one was laughing anymore. It became clear that this was no offhand remark. It was a direct assault on Canada's sovereignty, an assault 9 in 10 Canadians wouldn't stand by. As if that wasn't bad enough, Trump then publicly described Canada as one of the nastiest countries to deal with. And so, this became personal. Trump was now trying to undermine Canada's international standing and paint the country as difficult and uncooperative. But it wasn't Trump's verbal war alone that made Canada reevaluate its position. The full-on trade war was what finally did it. Trump's administration imposed sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods, particularly steel and aluminium, actions that harmed key Canadian sectors and threw the long-standing trade relationship between the two countries into turmoil. Canada then retaliated with its own tariffs on American goods, further escalating the tensions. Carney understood the stakes and responded by pointing out that while Canada couldn't control the policies of its largest trading partner, it could chart its own path forward. He also made sure to take a slight jab at Trump, saying that Canada doesn't pretend to control policies of other countries. To add insult to injury, these words were spoken in London during his first official visit we mentioned earlier. However, Carney wasn't in Europe to engage in petty tit-for-tat with Trump. His visit, while symbolic in many ways, was also driven by a much bigger agenda. Carney wanted to build new trading corridors, leverage Canada's vast energy resources, and foster stronger partnerships outside of the US sphere of influence. He was also there to drive home a crucial point. Canada won't just sit on the sidelines while the world watches Ukraine fight for its survival. For years, NATO and the US have been the backbone of European security, but with Washington dialing back its involvement, perhaps out of war fatigue or shifting priorities, Europe is waking up to the fact that it needs to take more responsibility for its own defense. The continent can no longer simply coast on the coattails of American military might. This is where Carney's leadership becomes so important. By inviting Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to the G7 summit in Alberta, Carney is making a bold statement. Canada will not let Ukraine, and by extension Europe, be unprotected. While the US may be stepping back, Canada is stepping forward. But let's be real for a second. The simple truth is that the US's retreat from the European front line leaves a gaping hole, a hole that Canada alone can't even dream to fill. So why is Carney so confidently turning his back to the US? Because Canada isn't really expected to fend for itself. Though Carney has said that the country doesn't need other people to come to its aid, Europe is coming together to defend Ukraine and, in turn, the entire continent. But wait a second, Canada isn't even in Europe, so why is the country so eager to get involved in Europe's defense? Well, Carney doesn't seem to prioritize geography when it comes to global responsibility. His bold declaration that Canada is the most European of non-European countries at the Élysée Palace in Paris makes it clear. Canada might not be physically on European soil, but it's very much invested in European security. Because let's face it, Canada's own future is deeply intertwined with Europe's, especially now when the US is out of the picture. Now, so far it's all been talk, grand declarations, ambitious speeches, and a flurry of diplomatic meetings. But what about action? What is Carney actually doing to show that Canada is serious about strengthening its partnership with Europe, especially in ways that don't involve the US? One of Canada's first commitments in Europe might be the so-called Coalition of the Willing. This coalition refers to a group of over 30 countries that, while not under NATO's formal command structure, are ready to act together to support Ukraine. The idea is to unite countries willing to contribute to Ukraine's defense, even if NATO's consensus is harder to reach due to internal divisions. Canada, despite being geographically distant, is very much in the mix, showing its willingness to help Ukraine. In fact, Canada's Defence Minister Bill Blair confirmed that the country is actively involved in discussions about joining the peacekeeping force if a ceasefire is achieved in Ukraine. Canada's involvement in the Coalition of the Willing is one way the country is proving its seriousness about its role in Europe's security, especially as it seeks to carve out a global role beyond its historic reliance on the US. But this coalition is just the beginning. Europe isn't just looking to protect Ukraine, it must also secure its future in a world where the US might not always be as reliable as it once was. In other words, Europe is rearming, and Canada is positioning itself as an integral part of this shift. Now, this rearmament is a massive undertaking. Europe is set to increase defense spending significantly, so much so that it's planning to loosen budget rules and introduce a $162 billion loan program. The aim? To build a self-reliant European defense industry capable of standing on its own 2 feet. European nations can no longer afford to be mere consumers of US defense systems. They must create their own technologies to safeguard their interests. Enter Canada. As Carney emphasized, he's actively exploring how Canadian companies can participate in developing European defense systems. In practical terms, this could mean Canadian factories building European fighter jets like the Saab Gripen, a direct competitor to the American-made F-35. Remember this, as we'll circle back to it later. The goal here is clear: create supply chains that reduce reliance on the US and shift some of the production to Canadian soil, benefiting both European defense capabilities and the Canadian industry. And Carney isn't playing coy. He wants as much as possible of that production to reside in Canada. The path to this expanded cooperation is already well underway. Canada has been in talks with the European Union about joining its defense initiative, which would allow Canada to collaborate on everything from fighter jets to missile systems. This partnership is crucial in Europe's bid to reduce its dependence on the US for defense procurement, as Trump isn't sparing the EU in his all-out trade war. The EU responded to the 25% US tariffs on imports of steel and aluminium by introducing counter-tariffs on $28 billion in US goods. This move effectively helped Trump's tariff war cross the Atlantic. Although there have been some delays and pauses since, Europe undoubtedly understood that it could no longer rely on the US 100%. That's why the EU now plans to have 65% of its military equipment sourced from within Europe or its partners like Canada. That's a monumental shift away from the current state, where 2/3 of Europe's military purchases are made from US suppliers. But let's be clear, this isn't just about filling the gaps left by the US, it's about seizing the opportunity to forge a deeper, more autonomous partnership between Canada and Europe. As Carney stated, this is prudent for Canada, securing its own defense needs while also contributing to the continent's security in meaningful ways. If Europe plays its cards right, raising individual defense budgets significantly, it could unlock a staggering $868 billion for defense spending, and Canada is there to ensure that the next chapter of the continent's defense is a transatlantic one, rooted in Europe but bolstered by Canada's industrial might and strategic alignment. But to fully take its place at this new table, Canada must first find alternatives for US weapons, and it must start at home. That's why the country announced its decision to reconsider its purchase of F-35 jets from Lockheed Martin, and let us tell you, this decision certainly raised some eyebrows. After all, we're talking about a deal valued at a staggering $13.3 billion for 88 jets, a deal that was supposed to signal Canada's commitment to modernizing its military. However, the winds of political and economic change are now stirring up doubts. Ottawa has already paid for the first 16 jets, which are scheduled for delivery in 2026, but it's far from clear whether the rest of the deal will go through. Defense Minister Blair outright confirmed that the country is exploring alternatives. So did Carney. The primary reason for rethinking the F-35 deal is Canada's over-reliance on US military equipment and, by extension, the US for security. Carney was rather blunt about it. "We must diversify," he told reporters in London. Currently, about 80% of Canada's defense budget goes to American weapons, and that dependence is becoming increasingly uncomfortable, especially in the face of the Trump administration's aggressive tariffs and hostile rhetoric. So in mid-March 2025, Carney ordered a full review of the F-35 deal. According to Carney, Canada must make sure that the contract in its current form is in the best interest of Canadians and the Canadian Armed Forces. The government's primary concern is not just the escalating cost of the F-35 program, but also the uncertainty surrounding Washington's political and economic behavior. Plus, Trump's tendency to weaponize military sales is not lost on Ottawa. The fear is real. Canada might lose access to essential parts and software upgrades for its F-35s if a political fallout occurs. So in an effort to sidestep these risks, Canada is considering alternatives from European suppliers. One such option is the Saab Gripen E from Sweden, which was a runner-up in the initial competition. With cutting-edge AESA radar, advanced electronic warfare systems, and AI-enhanced avionics, this redefines air superiority. Plus, Saab's pitch includes assembling the planes in Canada and offering a transfer of intellectual property, which would allow the country to maintain the aircraft independently. But as incredible as this switch sounds for Canada, it won't be easy to pull off. Any deal between Canada and Sweden would likely face scrutiny from the US, which has some control over key components. These include the engines in the Gripen through its partnerships with manufacturers like General Electric. As if to add more complexity, Bombardier, a key Canadian aerospace company, has voiced concerns about the potential fallout from backing out of the F-35 deal. The company fears that any shift in Canada's defense procurement could result in retaliation from Washington. Bombardier has ongoing contracts with the US military, and any disruption could harm its position in the US market. After all, about 60% of the company's business comes from the US. That's not to mention that its supply chain includes 2,800 US-based companies across 47 states. With these staggering figures in mind, Bombardier's fears start to make a lot more sense. But at the same time, the Canadian government has to weigh the economic benefits of cancelling the F-35 deal against the broader strategic implications of becoming too reliant on a single, unpredictable partner. However, Canada isn't relying on a single partner when seeking alternatives either. The Eurofighter Typhoon, a European collaboration among the UK, Germany, Italy and Spain, is on the table. The Rafale, produced by France's Dassault Aviation, could also be an option. However, its reliance on French technology presents integration challenges, especially given Canada's need for interoperability with the US military. While Canada is exploring its options, Lockheed Martin isn't sitting idle. The company is reportedly offering Canada additional job creation and other incentives if it sticks with the F-35 program. Yet the offer comes off as a desperate move to salvage a deal that's beginning to look increasingly untenable. However, it's not over yet. If Canada moves forward with a different jet, it will have to juggle a range of issues. One of the primary concerns is maintaining a mixed fleet of fighter jets. This would entail not just a massive overhaul of training, infrastructure, and maintenance, but also an increase in costs. Historically, the Royal Canadian Air Force has resisted such a move, given the complexity and logistical headaches it brings. Whether the F-35 deal survives this scrutiny remains to be seen, but one thing is clear: Canada is no longer willing to put all its eggs in the American basket. However, this doesn't mean that Canada wants to shut the American basket and kick it away. Carney did signal Canada's willingness to engage with the US, but only once there's a foundation of mutual respect. Plus, Canada remains deeply integrated with the US economically and strategically, with the trade between the two countries nearing $1 trillion. To put this figure into perspective, the EU was Canada's second largest trading partner, with trade worth 10 times less, $100 billion. Then there's the two countries' close partnership on issues of national security, defense, and global stability, largely through NATO and various joint initiatives. Those aren't ties that you can just cut overnight. Or are they? What do you think? Can Canada truly pivot away from its reliance on the US, or is the economic and strategic bond too strong to break? And how will the evolving geopolitical landscape shape the Canada-US and the Canada-Europe relationship in the future? Share your predictions in the comments section below.